Well, tonight we are going to begin with this breaking news from the New York Times that you've heard reported by Rachel Maddow. Here is the first paragraph of that story. Before arranging a meeting with a Kremlin-connected Russian lawyer he believed would offer him compromising information about Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump Jr. was informed in an email that the material was part of a Russian government effort to aid his father's candidacy, according to three people with knowledge of the email. The email to the younger Mr. Trump was sent by Rob Goldstone, a publicist and former British tabloid reporter who helped broker the June 2016 meeting. Joining us now, Jill Wine-Banks, former Assistant Watergate Special Prosecutor, Ron Klain, former Chief of Staff to Vice Presidents Joe Biden and Al Gore, and a former senior aide to President Obama. He's also a former Chief Counsel to the Senate Judiciary Committee, and he was Chief of Staff to Attorney General Janet Reno. Also with us, Bill Browder, the CEO of Hermitage Capital Management and the author of Red Notice. He actually knows the Russian lawyer who met with Donald Trump Jr. in this meeting. Ron Klain, I want to go first of all to you with this latest development in the sequence of stories we've had this weekend. What does this add to the story as it is now, to know that there's an email that Donald Trump Jr. received saying that this was about the Russian government trying to help his father win the election?
Yeah, Lawrence, you know, the loud thudding noise your viewers hear behind me is the sound after 6 months of a giant shoe finally dropping in this investigation. Just 6 months ago, the vice president told us that no one on their campaign had met with the Russians. Then one by one, we've learned about these meetings. But all along until now, they insisted the meetings were about policy or getting to know you. And now we finally know that there were meetings between senior Trump officials, Donald Trump Jr., and of course, Jared Kushner, Paul Manafort, with Russian liaisons to talk about how the Russian government could aid the Trump campaign. And that is a giant turn in this unfolding story.
Jill, we have someone who Donald Trump Jr. says he met when the Trumps went to Russia with their beauty pageant. That person, who's not a Russian citizen, this Goldstone guy, sends an email saying, I want you to meet. It'd be good if you met with this Russian lawyer, might be able to help with the campaign. Now that we have the element in the email of, and this will be information from the Russian government, what does that mean legally?
This is an astounding thing. We have, for sure, more evidence for Mr. Mueller to look at and get the details of, but it is collusion with a foreign adversary if they were working together to get the information from the Russian government. And that's what this looks like. It looks like clear proof of collusion.
Bill Browder, you know Natalia Veselnitskaya, the lawyer who was in this meeting, the Russian lawyer. Apparently Donald Trump changed his story over the weekend. First he said the meeting had nothing to do with campaign issues. It was all about adoption and repairing the rules that would allow adoption of Russian babies. Then the next day, his statement said, no, it was about getting actual campaign information. That's what the meeting was really about. And then she turned it into a meeting about adoption, which disappointed Donald Trump Jr. And now tonight, we have this latest element of the information. What do we know about who Donald Trump Jr. and Jared Kushner and Paul Manafort were meeting with that day?
Well, first of all, they were meeting with a person who is representing the Russian government, not a person who is acting in a personal capacity. They were meeting with a person from the Russian government who had a specific agenda, which was to repeal sanctions, what's called Magnitsky sanctions against human rights violators from Russia, and which is something very important to Vladimir Putin. And she was coming armed with something, with a quid pro quo. She basically, the Russians understand that if they want something from the Americans, if they want something from Donald Trump, they have to offer something in return. Now, I don't know exactly what she was offering, but I know exactly what she was asking for, which was to repeal sanctions against Russian torturers and murderers, which is something that's very sensitive to Vladimir Putin.
Bill, take a minute and tell us how these sanctions were put in place and why they were put in place and whose name is on those sanctions, how that happened.
So the sanctions are called the Magnitsky Act. The Magnitsky Act is a piece of legislation named after my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky. Sergei Magnitsky was an anti-corruption lawyer in Moscow who uncovered a massive $230 million Russian government corruption scheme. He exposed it. He was then arrested by Russian government officials, tortured in prison, and killed at the age of 37 7 years ago. And I've gone on a mission to Washington to get a piece of legislation in place, which was passed, called the Magnitsky Act, which imposes visa sanctions and asset freezes on Russian human rights violators. This is something that very much upsets Vladimir Putin.
Ron Klain, the sourcing for the New York Times original article was 3 advisors to the White House briefed on the meeting with 2 others with knowledge of it. Advisors to the White House. So that indicates to me they are probably people working outside of the White House, but this is a Trump-friendly group of sources for the New York Times article. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's hard to know what to make of that, Lawrence. I think that, tonight, in fact, the White House is kind of doing backflips on this, and Kushner and Manafort are saying, hey, no big deal. We disclosed this in the umpteenth time we updated our disclosure forms. And so, I think they're trying to spin this as best they can. But really, the bottom line, Lawrence, is this. Up until now, there's been a question of whether or not the Trump campaign tried to collude with the Russians. Now we know they tried to collude. The only question is whether or not they got the job done. And that really significantly changes the direction of this investigation.
Jill, one of the things that strikes me about the sourcing on this is that because it comes from Trump-friendly sources, one of the things you want to ask yourself is, who is this helping? Who is this helping within the Trump administration? And it's Jared Kushner in this meeting who actually has some criminal liability because he was supposed to disclose this on his application for security clearance. He didn't, and he only recently updated this disclosure. And so as you read deeply in the New York Times article, you discover, oh, so the government now does know about this meeting. And also, as you read even more deeply than that, you discover that the House committee investigators know about the meeting. Therefore, Trump administration people had to know this meeting is eventually going to come out. What is the least damaging way for us to bring it out? What's the least damaging time for us to bring it out? And that might have been the decision they made this weekend.
I think the least damaging time would have been when it first happened. I think I wouldn't be presumptuous enough to offer advice to the president, but I would to his legal team. One of the first lessons you learn as a lawyer, and certainly one we learned in Watergate, is stop the drip, drip, drip. Get everything out that you know right away. It's much less damaging if you announce it than if you wait until your opponents announce it. And they're not doing that. There are too many unreported meetings that we've already learned about, and we only learn about them when someone else finds out, usually the media. So we need to get it done, and they need to get the truth out. As voters, we need to know this information.
Bill Browder, given all of your information, all of your experience with Russia and working there, what do you make of this story, the full picture of this story as you see it tonight?
Well, what I see is that the Russians have a bunch of objectives. Putin has a bunch of objectives, and he's been trying to achieve those objectives. One of those objectives is about sanctions. I think it's very significant that a person from Russia came to the Trump administration asking for sanctions to be repealed. He has other objectives which have to do with America not supporting NATO, America not supporting Ukraine, and America not supporting the European Union. These are all Putin's objectives, and Putin is working very hard on this, and it's extremely worrying to see any lapse that the United States will have in terms of any of these objectives, which are all very important to keep in place to keep Russia in check.
Bill, do you expect to hear anything from this Russian lawyer? Do you think she will make any more public statements about this?
I'm sure she will. I'm sure she will. I've been dealing with her as an adversary for the last 3 years. She's very brash, very bold. I'm sure I don't think she's ever been in the center of such a storm as this one, but I'm sure she'll come out and say something which will be completely untrue when she does, and it will confuse some and firm up others' opinion of what happened here. But you should absolutely expect to hear something from her.
Deep in one of the New York Times report this morning, it says Mr. Manafort, the former campaign chairman, also recently disclosed the meeting and Donald Trump Jr.'s role in organizing it to congressional investigators who had questions about his foreign contacts, according to people familiar with the events. And so, Ron, it seems to me that the Trump administration knew this is coming out. Manafort's disclosed it. The House investigators know it. Now it's on Jared Kushner's disclosure form, finally. And it represents a possible crime in Jared Kushner's case because he did not put it on his original disclosure forms. And so at some point, the Trump administration has the decision, do we want to see this thing come out in the middle of a House hearing that Jared Kushner's the witness at, where it lands as a bombshell on Jared Kushner? Or do we want it to come out before that and maybe come out with Donald Trump Jr. being the star of the article, because Donald Trump Jr. doesn't face the same criminal liability as Jared Kushner does?
Yeah, you know, they're shaping up for a very interesting Thanksgiving dinner in the Trump household. You know, I mean, it does feel to me, Lawrence, kind of like you implied, that perhaps this story was put out and hung on Donald Trump's son to move it away from Donald Trump's son-in-law, who definitely has more legal exposure, who is right in the heart of the White House, who's in the middle of all these policy matters, who played a role in firing Director Comey, who supposedly was one of the people who advised the president to fire Director Comey, who's been, you know, threatening your colleagues here at MSNBC with bad stories and all these things. And so, you know, it may well be, as incredible as this is, that this was an effort by the Trump White House to hang this on Donald Trump Jr. and move it away from Jared Kushner.
Jill, the other part of this story that that is still unfolding is what are the words in that email that have been described to the New York Times? The New York Times article does not quote the email. It simply says that there is an email, and that in that email it says that the material was part of a Russian government effort, that becomes clear in the email. But we have not seen that email. We don't know the words of that email yet. And so there is more evidence to unfold here.
There is, and that's the job of Mr. Mueller and his team. And I trust that they will start interviewing all the right people. They will obtain that memo, and then they will know what to do with it. It's only speculation right now, although, you know, you can only have so much smoke before you have to admit that there is a fire. And I think we're at the point where there is much more than just a smoky room.
Bill, given your Russian experience, if the Russian government had information that they wanted to let the Trump campaign know about, does this sound like the route they would take? Go through people who worked with Trump when he was there for his beauty pageant, then get to this lawyer, put this lawyer in a room in Trump Tower?
Yeah, well, I mean, basically, they at the early stages, they probably didn't know how to get a hold of Trump, and this was, you know, through this beauty contest was a smart way of getting to him. I'm sure that the Russians didn't just use this channel if they wanted to approach the Trump campaign. I'm sure they used other channels. I'm sure that as time goes on, we'll learn about what ways in which they communicated and didn't. But we know for sure that this particular lawyer was working as an agent of the Russian government for a very important project for Vladimir Putin, and so this would make sense and fit right into the whole picture of them trying to influence U.S. policy through Donald Trump.
Let's listen to what Donald Trump Jr. said last year after, we now know, after he got this email.
I can't think of bigger lies, but that exactly goes to show you what the DNC and what the Clinton camp will do. They will lie and do anything to win. You hear it with the DNC, where they're leaking emails about Bernie Sanders and his Jewish heritage to be able to try to destroy him in the South. It's a rigged system. It's disgusting, and the people should be fed up, because when I heard it, I certainly was.
Ron, that was Donald Trump Jr. talking about how all the talk about Russian hacking was just a lie. He was already in possession of an email, according to the New York Times, saying the Russian government wants to help.
Yeah, Lawrence, I think you ought to invite him on your show to come on tomorrow night and apologize to Robbie Mook, who in that interview he called despicable for saying that there was evidence that the Russians were working with the Trump campaign. And he gave that interview just days after he had this meeting where we now know he was sent an email saying, hey, we want to come help. We're the Russians. We want to come help you beat Hillary Clinton. And so clearly he was just telling a bold-faced lie, throwing accusations, and he owes Secretary Clinton, her campaign, everyone involved, a big apology for that.
Bill Browder, thank you very much for joining us tonight with your unique perspective on all of this. Really appreciate it. Also, Jill Wine-Banks, thank you for joining us again tonight. Appreciate it.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.